Scanos Wagwego, Deawandate Nigaso, Otahione, Newagishot Dan Ganyak Kyono Niwakwenzodat. So I basically just explained who I am in one of the Indigenous languages of my people that Ryan had already explained. So I'm a member of the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation, and I'm from the Grand River Territory, which is more commonly known as Six Nations or Down the Bush, depending on who you're talking to and where you're at. Although I think our concept of the bush is a little bit different from the concept of the bush here. You guys have bigger critters than we have. I also want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of this place. Certainly, of course, those people of the Treaty 1 communities, as well as the Métis people and other Indigenous peoples that have lived here in the past and the present. Winnipeg, to my understanding, has always been a place of multiple peoples coming together. And so I'm very excited to get to be here again. Haven't been here in a while. It's certainly a far better city than it gets talked about out east. So no, I always enjoy the opportunity to be here. I also want to thank the Oral History Center, and I'm very honored and humbled to have the opportunity to be a Riley Fellow and be a part of that program. Also wish to acknowledge Nolan and Kent for guiding me well tonight, and then of course Ryan and Mary Jane McCallum, who've been excellent hosts as well. And with that, I'm going to jump into talking about a project that I'm cautiously and boldly, I think, jumping into right now. Sometimes the boldness is there and sometimes it's not. So if you have questions at any time, I'm happy to take them. It may work better to take them a bit later, but if something's burning, ask, because you'll probably forget, and I probably won't remember what I was talking about at the time either. So if it's something that you think might help others, by all means, please ask it. I also may, depending on how long I go, I may end up sitting for a while, but if you can't see me properly or hear me properly, let me know. So the project that I want to talk about tonight is inspired, oddly, by the Library and Archives Canada's decision to eliminate interlibrary loan, particularly around microfilm materials. So if you have any background working in particularly the RG10 collection, those of us who work in Native history, that's where most of us have spent a lot of quality time. Not always all that great quality, but definitely time in the reading room and or time in other reading rooms when we've ordered things by interlibrary loan. For those of us who have graduate students that work in document-based historical research, you've probably assigned microfilm reels to be ordered by your students for them to get reacquainted or get acquainted with the microfilm reader. And those of you who are probably under the age of 25 are saying, what's microfilm? So unless, you've had a geeky prof that made you do something with microfilm. So inspired by Library and Archives Canada's budget cut that was supposedly about enhancing and quickening their digitization of documents so everyone could have access to them, I actually decided to take the resources that were allocated to me, i.e. research assistants, graduate students, from the history department at the University of Western Ontario, and tell them they were going to start looking for stuff. And they were going to order in microfilm reels, and they were going to digitize everything they could get their hands on. That time, we were given a deadline of February 2013 as the elimination of the program. Well, somewhere along the line, somewhere in October of 2012, the date changed without a massive info blast to let people know the date changed. So they actually eliminated interlibrary loan as of midnight on December 11th, 2012. I heard that the deadline had changed maybe a week before. And December and grad students isn't always the best time to try to light a fire. But we got as many reels as we could. And I had 3 graduate students actually working on the project, as well as any undergraduate students that I could get money for through our work-study program. And the focus of that, I'll tell you about next, pertains particularly to the 11 First Nations communities in what's considered Southwestern Ontario. Now, some of you, if you're familiar with the area, you'll think my count's a little off, and I'll explain that in a moment. And of course, the focus, as I said, was coming out of the Government of Canada files, primarily out of the RG10 collection, although a number of files also exist in some of the other government document collections. But our initial focus was on the RG10s. Now, some people might think about this and think, so what? This is the white man's record. This is what they had to say. This is what the Indian agents were saying. This is, sometimes clergy. And certainly there's a lot of room for critique of that record. However, for many of these communities, and likely it's a similar story across the board for most First Nations communities, they're the only written records that exist, or the bulk of written records that exist, and in many cases have really useful information if you know how to read what you're looking at. So the whole goal of this project is to find that information, digitize it when possible, make notes when digitization isn't possible, and get that information back into the communities. The vast majority of these communities, and probably it fits for most First Nations again, don't have access to that information. They don't have copies of it. Even if they were somehow able to get their hands on a microfilm, they probably don't have a reader. Or they may not know how to use it even if they had the reader and the microfilm. Because if a bulb burns out, I don't even know how to replace that on my microfilm scanner. In other words, and for most people, that access to that type of information just doesn't exist. And even, I would say, at all levels of most First Nations communities. There's other priorities for sure. Generally, there aren't a whole lot of people that have expertise in this. And those who do are probably busy doing something else. So I was looking at this as a way to build skills in our students, many of whom come from these communities, as well as then students that come from neighboring non-Indigenous communities, in order to get information back into the hands of the people that it's about. This also then, because I'd go crazy if I was trying to do this by myself, and even just with my grad students, that's when Dr. McCallum got the phone call, and I said, what do you think about this? Dr. McCallum comes from one of these First Nations communities as well, even though we've graciously let Winnipeg borrow her for a while. We hope to reel her back home. But I reached out to other people that I knew had an interest and also had a background in doing this kind of work. Most recently, we've started approaching the First Nations libraries that exist in most of these communities. 6 of the 11, well, actually technically 7 of the 11 have First Nations libraries. And so we're reaching out to work with them as the main conduit for information sharing with the communities that we're getting information about. So the reason for this, in terms of getting the information back into the hands of the people, is that much of what is known in the communities and in the neighboring communities is poorly informed at best and usually wrongly informed. So poorly informed in that it's usually just part of the story, but in most cases it's wrongly informed, where either people who do have a sense of the history get it out of local newspapers that, talk about the drunken savages and their wild parties, which is almost always a mistake in terms of the report. I'm not going to say that none of that has ever happened in my community. I'm sure it has. But the representations historically that have been presented about our communities have usually been poor examples of historiography. The other component of this, and there's certainly been a resurgence in our communities about knowing the history of our people and of the places that we now inhabit, is that much of that agenda has been land claims focused, which is a system created by the Canadian government and or the U.S. government, because most of our communities also are part of or connected to land claims in the States. All of our communities have historical connections to communities that exist south of the border. And so that agenda of land claims history focuses upon this idea of sole exclusive jurisdiction over a particular place and has no real mechanism to address where you may have shared territory and where you have multiple jurisdictions that historically often coexisted very peacefully. Not always, but often. There's no room for that in land claims history, because when you start to say, well, you know, the Delawares live here, but the Chippewas lived there first, and before that there were the Attawandaron, but they don't exist anymore, Canada doesn't know how to comprehend that. And they'll often just say, oh, so you're all newcomers because the Attawandaron are gone. So you're all immigrants too. Don't you want to sing "O Canada" now? Doesn't usually work that well. Unfortunately, because of limited resources, because of other tensions that we've inherited, both historically as well as contemporary, often our people buy into that as well. In many cases, it's the only mechanism to get any kind of restitution for what's been taken from our people. It's also often the only mechanism for opportunity, for any type of development or educational opportunities, et cetera. And so we've quite effectively bought into this idea of competing against each other for limited resources via the Indian Claims Commission in various reincarnations of it. There's also been a focus on this concept of rights, which in most cases is very contradictory to Indigenous philosophy. When I sit in the Longhouse, what I'm told, what our speakers tell us, is that we have been given everything we need to survive, and it's our responsibility to be thankful for that. If we're not thankful, we have no rights to anything. So that this concept of rights is, in my understanding, completely contradictory to, at least in the teachings of my people, and what I find in the teachings of other Indigenous peoples who I've had the opportunity to speak with and learn from. That's a pretty consistent thing. The idea of rights, at the very most, is secondary to upholding your responsibilities. And so again, we get put into this whole conundrum of having to say and articulate and fight for our rights, which ends up making us very contradictory to what our traditional teachings are about. I'm not saying that means, oh, there's no such thing as Aboriginal rights, because I disagree, because we're talking about the Canadian and or U.S. legal system, and that is a rights-based agenda. But if we're framing our historical understanding of ourselves in relationship to our own people and to our neighbors, focusing upon this idea of rights as the central theme puts us automatically into tension with our neighbors, and often within as well. And let's face it, we have more than enough things to not like each other about, both within and with our neighbors. We don't need history to reinforce that any more than it already does. So I'm not looking to whitewash, literally or figuratively, our past. I'm looking for ways to remember how our communities were interconnected. Earlier today, in a talk I was giving in the history department, I made a joke about the fact that Mary Jane, Dr. McCallum, comes from the Munsee Delaware First Nation. I come from Six Nations of the Grand River. I actually live in the Delaware part of the community. The corner, which is about a half a kilometer from my house, is Montour Corners, and it's the Delaware Montours, not the Mohawk Montours, which, if you've never been there, I know makes absolutely no sense, but if you've been there, you know. And I commented that we're probably related via my husband, who's an Oneida citizen from Oneida of the Thames, which is across the river from Munsee, Delaware. But probably my husband and Mary Jane's family are probably the relatives through their connections at Chippewa-the-Thames. And if you're Oneida or Munsee, you don't usually talk about your relatives at Chippewa-the-Thames. But they all have them. Right, Mary Jane? It's just like, at home, we don't often talk about our Tyendinaga relatives, but my grandpa grew up there, I have to admit. So in other words, if we look in our own family trees, and I'm sure that for other folks in the room, it's usually multiple communities that we are somehow connected to, if not through direct lineage, at least through some form of kinship. And yet, this historical understanding that we've inherited in our communities, at least in Southwestern Ontario, is one of separation from these other communities, and often one even of animosity against these other communities. At Six Nations, the southeastern portion of our territory is inhabited by a group of Mississaugas who originated from the Credit River area. And I've used very careful words with that, right? But the reality is that, yes, we consider them to be visitors to our territory, but they've been visiting since 1847. And the reality is that most of their people probably have as much genetic Mohawk blood as any Mohawk from Six Nations does. I mean, let's face it. You're looking at the same 1,800 people, and you get 400 new ones that come in. It always looks a little bit better on the other side of the field, right? And that's also part of our survival. So even though there are political tensions that exist between us, what I'm hoping will come out of this research is an understanding and a respect for the historical relationships that we've inherited as well. And ideally, to come out of that with a way of finding cooperation between our communities. Again, not saying, we're all going to lodge a single land claim and split it evenly, and, we're going to institute a First Nations communist state in Southwestern Ontario. That ain't going to happen. But what I'm saying is that it would be nice if we found a way to honor those historical relationships that have made each of our communities what they are today. So I kind of went off on a tangent there, but... So I previewed this a bit with... So what I'm giving you here is the listing, and this is where you think where you'll find my math seems a bit suspect. So as I noted earlier, the Attawandaron people are referred to as the Indigenous peoples that lived in this region pre-1650. And they're an Iroquoian people. And actually, Attawandaron is what the Huron people called them. It's not really what they called themselves. There's some conflicting information on their own name for themselves, but they also were actually a confederacy of nations. And the one that I'm most familiar with is the Onondaga. Anyone ever ski in Southern Ontario? There's a place referred to as the Blue Mountains, right? Collingwood. The reason it's called the Blue Mountains is because that's where the Onondaga people came from. And Onondaga means bright hills. And if you're approaching Collingwood region from a distance, they glow almost. And it's like this blue type haze around them. And it's not that they're burning odd wood or odd plants. It's just that region. It's probably because of the lakes. They're close to Lake Simcoe and Lake Huron. They get this bluish haze. So, and it's close to my longhouse name, so that's how come I can remember that one. Their names tend to be really, really long. And it's probably because they're old names and they haven't been used much in the contemporary context where we tend to shorten words and names. When people ask me, I suggest to them that they think about the Indigenous peoples of Southern Ontario as including the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Lenape. Haudenosaunee because those of the neutral people who survived epidemics and war fled to the east and settled amongst the Seneca and Cayuga nations and became absorbed into the Haudenosaunee people. they were also relatives of ours in terms of language and culture. Anishinaabe, in that there's certainly evidence that demonstrates presence of Anishinaabe peoples at least for 1,000 years in parts of southwestern Ontario, particularly along the major waterways. So Walpole Island, for example, there's evidence that people have been there, Anishinaabe people, for close to 1,000 years. There's also new archaeological evidence, particularly around the Bruce Peninsula, that are putting Anishinaabe settlements there, again, for about 1,000 years, off and on. Oddly enough, they're actually finding settlements that appear to have inhabitation at the same time or within a 30-year range, because archaeology isn't a perfect science, of Haudenosaunee longhouses and Anishinaabe lodges next to each other, like, one end of this room to the other next to each other, which throws things all into turmoil in terms of what we understand about our historic relations with each other. And then the Lenape, although newer to this specific territory, have a very historic, old relationship to both the Haudenosaunee people and the Anishinaabe people. Technically speaking, they are related to the Anishinaabe. They're an Algonquian-speaking people. But both the Haudenosaunee people and the Anishinaabe people refer to the Lenape as our grandfathers. And that comes from their presence on the East Coast, Manhattan, New Jersey, Delaware, that area. And if you look at historic texts from either Iroquoian people or Algonquian people, they refer to the Delaware as the grandfathers. So there's obviously a very ancient relationship there. And it makes sense, actually, when you understand that, as to how Lenape people end up in southwestern Ontario. So I've listed here 11 different First Nations on 10 lines. Some of you are probably somewhat familiar with Kettle and Stoney Point, as it's described, probably in relationship to the Ipperwash incidents and the unfortunate death of Dudley George, who was standing up for the reclamation of the Stoney Point territory to the Stoney Point people. Now, officially, under Canadian law, it is the Kettle and Stoney Point First Nation, but historically, and I'm talking about like 60 years historically, I guess 70 now, they were two separate but very connected communities. The Stoney Point community was inhabited primarily by Potawatomi people who had moved into the area from areas south of Michigan. They went up into the Manitoulin Island region and then down the waterways. So the people of Stoney Point have very tight family connections to the Potawatomi people in Manitoulin, and then also to the Potawatomis in Walpole Island. But distinct but very tightly connected to Kettle Point. And so that's why 10 lines constitutes 11 First Nations. We'll see how well that flies with the different chiefs' councils and stuff. But this is a kind of spotty map that I was able to pull off the internet that shows the placement of the First Nations communities. Certainly, this wasn't taking into idea of the larger geographical scale. The lake you see on the left is the lower part of Lake Huron. Actually, that's the lower part of Lake Huron. The very lower part is, what's that lake? St. Mary's. No, it's not the St. Mary's. Lake St. Clair, which connects Lake Huron and Lake Erie. Lake Erie is the lower lake that you see. And then you see just a little bit of Lake Ontario. So this peninsula that is referred to as southwestern Ontario is really the convergence of the lands in between these major waterways, which also makes a lot of sense why we have people from so many different places that end up coming together in this place. Now a lot of people would think of this project and think that it's strictly Ontario-centric and Southern Ontario-centric, because there's hundreds of First Nations that don't fall into this. In fact, roughly about 122 of them, 123 of them, that are Ontario First Nations that don't fall into this category. So it's important to understand why this region is relevant to other peoples, why it should be of interest to other First Nations people, to other Indigenous folks, and to Canadians and Americans. It's most recently got the attention of folks because of the War of 1812 commemorations, because this was where it was fought. Much of it, not all of it, but a significant portion of the War of 1812 took place literally in these communities and between the roads that connect these communities. So, Battle of the Thames, Battle of Beaver Dams, Battle of Queenston Heights. Now, what you might not hear about, although we got a little bit of mention, but certainly when I was a student in the States, hearing about the War of 1812, first of all, Isaac Brock doesn't make the U.S. history books. Sorry. But we didn't hear about the Indigenous folks and their involvement in the War of 1812. We heard a little bit about the Cherokee and their participation. But even though I grew up in Michigan, which is just to the left of the map here, and involves relatives in this whole area, we didn't hear about that. So it's gotten some attention lately, but what's particularly, I think, relevant about this to other peoples, why other people should find this interesting, is that this is a really interesting microcosm to look at Indigenous Crown relations, both in a historic pre-Confederation as well as post-Confederation context. It's also a very interesting example, or set of examples really, to think about migration. In many cases, at least semi-forced, if not forced migration of Indigenous peoples. Related to that, then, often came the speculators of usually a previously American nature who made their millions speculating Indian land in Southwestern Ontario, which is very interesting in this week of events honoring the Royal Proclamation. So even though this is actually one of the primary places that Loyalist people are settled, they're settled in many cases in complete violation of the Royal Proclamation on Indian land that the Crown had promised to protect forever, or until it was financially viable for them not to. I'm arguing and asserting that this is an international project because obviously most of the nations have homelands in what's now considered the U.S., but also because of the treaty relationships that our nations hold with various nations in Europe, primarily Britain, the Netherlands, and France. And my dream is to actually find someone that can translate Dutch and French, although we kind of have a ringer in French, or at least some basics in French, to actually look at the documents that exist in those countries about our peoples. There's some interesting footwork that's being done with the Dutch this year that I'll talk about in a bit. Another way to look at this, and particularly around the contemporary issues with homeland security and the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, is the fact that the border crossed us. All of our peoples have some historic connection to this place that predates the United States or Canada. Whether that was that we had hunting grounds in this region, or we had traveled through this region to get to other places, such as the Anishinaabe migration story, where they talk about several of the stopping places actually fall into this region. So these are things, some of which predate contact, or the magic moment that I like to refer to, that the Canadian courts are so wrapped up in, But this is an excellent example of what happens really across the U.S.-Canada border, because for the vast majority, actually probably I can't imagine any Indigenous nation that lives within 50 miles of that border that doesn't fall into this category as well. I'm sure it affects all of us, and I believe that we're within 50 miles of the border here. I know it's only about an hour drive, but I can't remember how fast we were going. This also falls into concepts of things like discussing what are the contemporary realities of things like the Royal Proclamation and the British North America Act. I was shocked, having grown up in the States and knowing what I had been trained to believe there, that when I came to Canada and started teaching in Canada, how little Canadians actually know about their own history. When I discovered that the majority of my students at not my current institution, but a previous institution that I worked at, didn't know when Canada became a country. I think it was 2009 when Harper made that statement about Canada being over 150 years old. He made some blunder, his speechwriter screwed up. And so I asked my students in my global studies course about Confederation. They didn't know. And these were Canadian educated Canadian citizens. We had the occasional international student from Africa and whatnot, although I usually found the international students knew more in terms of that type of thing. So if they don't know the piece of legislation that created the Dominion of Canada, there's no way that they're going to understand what Section 94 has to say in terms of Canada having the responsibility for Indians and land reserved for Indians, if they don't even know what the BNA is. So I was shocked, disparaged, and really confused by that. But in other words, this also demonstrates why this project is important for everyone, particularly in Southwestern Ontario. Also in this region, you'll find Canada's two oldest Indian residential schools, one of which is still standing as of today, but we've had public hearings in my community over the last week and a half about whether or not to tear it down. So those two would be the Mohawk Institute, established in 1828 on Six Nations land in what's now the city of Brantford, and then established in 1848? Yeah, in the 1840s, is the Mount Elgin Residential School, which was burned down in the 1970s and ceased to operate as a residential school in the 40s, but still operated as the day school for 3 different First Nations communities up until the late 60s. Dr. McCallum's mother taught there, actually. So the process that we're undertaking, that we've already started, certainly, requires a certain amount of understanding about Indian affairs record keeping, which has its own logic, which is usually pretty illogical. And one of the main things that you have to understand are the different names that were employed at different times by different people. Our initial document collection process is focused on what's known as the Caradoc Agency. And that would be primarily 4 First Nations communities, although at different times there were other First Nations put into the Caradoc Agency. It was primarily the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, Munsee Delaware First Nation, and the Oneidas of the Thames First Nation, and the Delaware First Nation. And they're all communities settled along the Thames River. The oldest records refer to that as the Western Superintendency Agency 2. You'll find Agency 1 as being listed primarily around Six Nations records. Not tons in that category, though. The most common is Caradoc, which is also a township in the area, and so you have to be careful when you're searching for Caradoc in the government collection, because you might get the township minutes or tax assessments or something. And then also, and today it's referred to as the London District. And at different times in history, it would sometimes include the community of Aamjiwnaang, also known as the Chippewas of Sarnia. For a very brief period in time, the Walpole Island First Nation, and then also sometimes, although I haven't quite pinned down the historical timing of it, sometimes Kettle Point and Stoney Point also are in that, but it seems kind of random. I think it depended on if the Indian agent was allowed in at the time, whether or not he reported in that category. Sometimes you'll also find the Walpole Island Agency listed on its own. And some interesting things that we found there that I was unaware of. Certainly some people in the community knew about, but many of the people that I talked to didn't know that at a time, the Potawatomis of Walpole Island had their own council. So again, similar to what we find at Kettle and Stoney Point, there's a precedent, at least at times, of there being recognition of two different bands at Walpole Island. And then the Six Nations Superintendency, also sometimes listed as the Grand River Superintendency, which usually also included New Credit, but not always. And there's complex things with that. Because of my dissertation research, I was pretty familiar with those records, and I already have, in the RG10 collection, I probably have about 2,000 documents that I photocopied. Back in the day, I don't think they do it anymore. If you went to the Indian Affairs Library in Hull, which is now Gatineau, you could print for free. They had microfilm printers. You could go in there. You could spend the whole day. No one ever bugged you. And you could just hit print for the whole day. So I have a lot of documents from there. Now they have USB ports. You can put your USB in and you can scan for free. I think that still happens. As a side note, if you're not an Ottawa research geek, you probably don't know this. The Indian Affairs Library has a full set of microfilms of the Indian Affairs collection. Now, of course, there's always stuff that fell off the microfilm truck that didn't get microfilmed, some of which they acknowledge still exist, some of which, we don't know what you're talking about. But you can, if you have a day in Ottawa and you want to get a lot of documents collected, you go to the Indian Affairs Library. It's boring and monotonous, but it's well worth it. If you have one day in Ottawa, that's where you go. Not to the reading room, certainly not ordering boxes and looking through stuff. If you got just one day, go to Hull. Last year, we also sought to undertake looking at the archival holdings at Western. So I sent one of my students to the archives. It's the Western Ontario Regional Archives. It happens to be housed at Western. And so she's nice, she's friendly, people help her with things. So that's who I sent there. And she was able to find a lot of stuff, because everybody has cutbacks in the archives these days, even at what I consider to be really well-funded universities. We find that. I'm sure that you're experiencing that here in the city of Winnipeg as well, probably at both universities. And I don't know how the Hudson Bay archives are doing. Are they well-funded still? I don't know. Anyway, most archives are not in a good state financially. So she was able to find quite a bit of stuff. Now, the most interesting archival collection in our midst is not available to us. And that would be the archives of the Anglican Church, housed at Huron University College, which is literally across the street from my office. And that's because those archives have been closed in response to litigation around residential schools. Interestingly enough, the Mohawk Institute was operated by the Anglican Church, although they say their records are in Toronto somewhere, but I don't quite believe it. And then the Mount Elgin records are supposed to be in Toronto as well, right? But the Anglican Church records for the whole of Southern Ontario are across the street from my office, but I can't access them. Not even my friendly grad students are allowed. My friendly white grad students, by the way. Because that's the other reality. You learn where it's safe to be brown and where it's not safe to be brown. And that's why it's really important and valuable to have allied scholars, because they can often find out things that nobody's going to tell me, but they'll tell my nice Irish-Scottish student from Ingersoll. And that's okay, and he understands that as well. But that's why we need friends, and why we need to be friends as well. So in that, I'm fortunate enough to have Indigenous and non-Indigenous allied graduate students, as well as some colleagues that see this as a valuable thing. Certainly the students find it very valuable. Right now we're doing this with no budget. We're in the process of compiling a SHRC application related to this, but we'll proceed with or without that funding. If we have the funding, there's a lot more fun stuff we can do with it. And as I said, most recently, we're partnering with the libraries that exist in most of the First Nations communities of relevance. Again, similar to what we find on university campuses and in mainstream communities, our libraries are extremely underfunded. But interestingly, tend to be some of the most popular places if they're able to have hours of open that work with people's schedules. Speaking from the library in my community, it is the youth center for our community of 14,000 residents. It is the only place for kids to go in the evening for socialization. And we're currently housed in an old doctor's residence that was built in the 1860s. We're way past capacity, but it is the de facto youth center in our community. There is nothing else that's officially provided for the kids in our community. It's also the main place for the elderly and the disabled to go, both for traditional library activities, but also socialization and the very popular internet. And so to find a capacity to hopefully get additional funds into our libraries, we know will greatly benefit our communities. And that's one of our primary goals for sure. So the photo that I have here is a veteran of the War of 1812. And they refer to her as Aunt Dinah. And she was a cook for the American troops. She came from Onondaga. And she served as a cook as a young woman, late teens, early 20s, by what we can estimate from the records. She didn't remember when she was born exactly, because nobody bothered to interview her until she was well into her 90s. So she was somewhere late teens, early 20s as a cook for the American soldiers. Didn't get her pension until she was in her 90s, but eventually did get her pension. So actually what we have about her in terms of the historic record comes from her testimony about trying to get her pension. But the interesting thing that we can take from this, beyond, first of all, a really rare example of a Native woman who's a veteran, is also a story of the fact that the Haudenosaunee people, much like Anishinaabe peoples, Cree peoples, and others, were split by the War of 1812. And in fact, often you have relatives fighting against each other or choosing not to fight in a particular battle because they knew that their relatives would be there. So for example, a number of men from Grand River went home when they heard the Senecas were coming to the battle at Chippewa. So that's just north of Fort Erie. A number of our men went home because they knew the Senecas were going to be there and they didn't want to be fighting the Senecas. In some cases, they were direct relatives. In other cases, we're talking about that Confederacy relationship that we had with the Seneca people. So when we look at these events, it's never as cut and dry and patriotic, maybe, as our Canadian colleagues might be looking at this stuff. And not to simplify the Canadian experience overly, but it's definitely a much more complicated story than it is for most of our non-Indigenous neighbors. And Aunt Dinah is certainly, I think, a really solid example of that. Some of the key questions that we're asking in this research obviously is about the historic connections between our communities. Not just understanding how it is that, my husband's grandma came from Bucktown, but he's in Oneida. But actually understanding how many people did intermarry between Bucktown, which is the Delaware Nation, also known as Moravian Town, but more commonly known as Bucktown. How much intermarriage was there? And how is it that some people came out of that identifying as Oneidas and some of it came out identifying as Lenape or Delaware? And then his aunt who decided to identify as a Chippewa. Because that's also about understanding the colonial realities, right? Her band membership was transferred when she married a man from Chippewa, the Thames, and went across the river, as they like to say at Oneida. In understanding our historic connections, we'll gain a better understanding of our shared history. And with that, and I think that the most important set of questions that can be asked about this is, as a result of this, what are the responsibilities we hold to each other now? Before we talk about our land rights, before we talk about our treaty rights and our right to buy cigarettes cheap, we ought to be talking about what are our responsibilities to each other. We know, although Canada's in a slightly better way right now, but we know that the governments of Canada and the US are in crisis. And even more so, we know that the environment that we all share, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, is in extreme crisis. And to me, the keys for understanding how to guarantee a future for our children and the generations after them exist in this information. I'm not saying, that this is going to be the Holy Grail. But I think actually one of the most critical parts of it is that we're going to be doing this together. And in that rekindling, shall we say, of those historic relationships and partnerships, we're going to remember how we're supposed to take care of each other. And that the best way to take care of each other is to make sure that that river that separates us is clean. And that also understanding that river that separates us is exactly what connects us. And that's not easy to do, obviously, but I believe that that's really the most important thing that can come out of this. Now, this belt that I have pictured here is the wampum belt that the chiefs at Grand River gave to John Brant. Anyone ever hear of John Brant? He was the youngest son of Joseph Brant, or JB as we refer to him at home. Joseph Brant was not a chief, but John Brant was. And it's interesting that sometimes if you read some of the biographies of Joseph Brant, the historians think that John Brant was a chief because his dad was a chief. Like I said, his dad wasn't a chief. John Brant was a chief because his mother was a clan mother. John Brant was a chief because his mother's brother was Degulli Hogan before he was. So he ascended to lineal traditional leadership because of who his mother was and because of his uncle who helped to raise him in the traditional fashion that an uncle helps to raise his nephews. That's why he became a chief, not because his dad was popular amongst the Brits. Unfortunately, he also became ill with cholera in 1832. This was shortly after he'd been elected to the provincial legislature. It was also, in 1828, he became the Indian agent for Six Nations. So talk about conflicting hats that this man wore. He was a traditional chief. He was the Indian agent and translator because he was fluent at least in Mohawk and probably also in Onondaga and maybe in Cayuga or Oneida as well. And then also extremely literate in English. And then he was elected to the provincial legislature, although his election was revoked because a number of the people who voted for him were leaseholders and not landowners. And so someone else was put into his place. Actually, I think it's one of the Campbells, who then was related to one of the Thompsons, who ended up with one of the largest estates of Six Nations land on the river that's held by non-Six Nations people. Known as the Ruthven Estate, the last member of the family actually wrote the report that the Canadian government used to justify the takeover of our traditional council in 1924. It's a long, sordid history between our families, shall we say. And now the Ruthven Estate and its archives are closed to Six Nations researchers. And my Ingersoll Scottish-Irish grad student has been told he could have access until they realized who he worked with. And then all of a sudden, oh, no, we're still restructuring. Is there...
Oh, is that the Mohawk Institute that you mentioned?
Yes. For the residential school?
The building that was founded in 1828.
Yeah, that's the Mohawk Institute, also referred to as what's commonly known as the Mush Hole back home. There's actually a book called The Mush Hole that has some of the oral histories of the students that were there. Focuses mainly on the 1920s, the 19-teens and 20s. But Ruthven is a different estate. So this belt was commissioned by the traditional chiefs, who were the governing body at Grand River at the time, to give to John Brant to remind him of his primary duty as a traditional chief and his primary responsibility to represent his mother's people in that capacity. A couple of contemporary things that are going on that are relevant to this stuff includes the Two-Row Wampum Renewal Campaign, which still has a number of events going on, although the primary focus was on August 9th at the UN, where a group of folks had paddled canoes, including a dugout canoe from Onondaga, all the way to New York City, and then they paddled back. My friend Rick Hill always jokes about the fact that we preferred to acquire the Algonquin and Ojibwe canoes made out of birch bark because they were lighter and they traveled better. And that sometimes that trade was mutual and sometimes it was singular in terms of how we got those canoes. But they used the old-fashioned dugout canoe. I was a bit worried that it might not make it back because they become really waterlogged after a while, and you wouldn't normally use them every single day. Traditionally, we would have gone so far, maybe a couple days paddle, and then stopped and hunted and let it dry out. But they were canoeing every day for, I think, about 3 weeks. So I was a little worried that it might become a little too waterlogged. But this is ongoing. Primarily, it's taken the mechanism, or it's taken on the focus of public education, particularly around the communities between Onondaga all the way to New York City and back, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, as a means of reminding people about the original treaty between Europeans and the Haudenosaunee, which is highly relevant to anyone who lives in the state of New York, but also relevant really to anyone that lives in the US or Canada because of the British assumption of the responsibilities of this treaty in 1664. But they focused mainly on the 1613 stuff. And actually, 2 weeks ago, a couple of representatives of the Confederacy traveled to the Netherlands and presented the Dutch with a replica belt of the Two-Row. And some of you who may not know much about Haudenosaunee history may still be familiar with this image because lots of other people have used it. It shows up in the Royal Commission report. It shows up in, I think, Citizens Plus. I think it might be on the back of Citizens Plus. It's been used in a number of other places, but its origin is Haudenosaunee and Dutch. Was there a question?
Oh, didn't they just get the real one back?
Actually, the Two-Row, the real one we've always had. There's one that we just got back, and I don't have it in this PowerPoint, of the War of 1812 belt. It's the Klaus belt, they refer to it as, and that was held at the Smithsonian, and we just got that back a year ago, April. And it was the promise from the Brits that everything would revert back to how things were prior to the War of 1812. So some of the public educators at Six Nations and some of the other local communities have then started to question about, well, what did we have in 1812 that we don't have now? For us, it's 95% of our land. It's our languages. And it's, for the most part, autonomy in terms of our governance, where there isn't meddling from outside governments. So those are the types of questions that are coming out of that. At Walpole, on the weekend, they're doing Rekindling Tecumseh's Vision honoring, where they're, and that's been a real, Tecumseh's been a real organizing point in the lower Thames communities, and then Walpole Island, mainly because that's the area where Tecumseh and some of the Shawnee people had settled, and they have descendants in that area as well. So that's it for what I had prepared to talk about. Certainly lots of exploration, and for those of us who are history buffs / geeks, lots of fun stuff that could be out there.